Philosophical Foundations of Three Sociologies, 1977, The Rise and Fall of Structural Marxism in 1984, and I think most recently this book, Philosophy of Social Science. Two editions of this have come through, which he wrote with Ian Craig, who sadly died not long ago, not in time to do the second edition. But this has been a very influential book. In fact, I recommend it to all my students, and I recommend it to you too. I'm not going to kind of deal with Ted. But that's one of his main concerns. The second one is really to do with the links between environment and society. And he's written a large number of books about this. I just want to mention, since we're a bit short of time, The Greening of Marxism, for which he was the editor. A very useful collection, which again can be fully recommended to students. I just wanted to mention, incidentally, Ted's Marxism in passing. Now, I once remember him saying to me, I asked him if he was a Marxist, and he said yes, but he said he disagreed with virtually everything which Marx said, which is interesting, and I think a very productive way of thinking about Marx. He's a kind of a Marxist, you know, I mean, he actually critiques everything which comes his way, but I guess he's still influenced by a great man. And the third theme, which might come as a bit of a surprise to you, is he is a naturalist, and a very well-known naturalist. An indication of that kind of work is this book, Bumblebees. And I think he's written a similar book, which I haven't actually seen yet, which is about grasshoppers and crickets. This Bumblebees book, it won the Stanford Raffles Prize by the Zoological Society of London. So Ted is, when we all talk about nature, which as sociologists we do, Ted actually knows what it is, how it works, little bits of it, and how it all fits together. So that's a very useful and a bit surprising, let's say, as a feature of a sociologist. The final theme is Ted being activist. A couple of books here. He is fully engaged in the politics of the environment at a local level. He has co-written this book, What on Earth is to be Done? I think you're going to mention this. And this is just, we're actually co-writing a follow-up to this, a second edition of this book at the moment. And I think what he's going to talk about is his part, his rather major part of this second edition. Finally, as an activist, I want to mention what I think is his latest book, although I might have missed 2 or 3. It came out just a few months ago. Alfred Russel Wallace, Explorer, Evolutionist, Public Intellectual, a thinker for our times. Excellent book. And in fact, actually, that leaves me with the message I want to leave you with, that Ted himself, not just Alfred Russel Wallace, is a thinker for our own times. Ted, you're very welcome.
After that, this is going to be a real disappointment. I've written something that could easily take an hour or more, and we haven't got that much time, so I may have to sort of summarise what I was going to say in places. And I should say that this book that we wrote collectively as a Red Green Study Group really tried to encapsulate back in 1993, I think. So it was a crucial time at the end of the Thatcher regime, and aspirations for real change as it became clear that Thatcher was on the way out, even if our ideas certainly weren't on the way out. So we actually put together a perspective that tried to link together green thinking, socialist thinking, feminist thinking and anarchist thinking. So it was a very broad discussion group that we set up. And it was a very exciting thing, how to find ways of establishing discourse between these different perspectives in a mutually respectful and constructive way. Actually, interestingly, it was surprisingly easy to do once we'd accepted some ground rules. Anyway, really, what I wanted to say, the perspective that I'm going to try and outline to you today, is a product of that collective engagement. I don't want it to be seen as my work. I mean, you know, discussions and reading Peter's work and other people in the group as well, all contributed. As we got a bit closer to this meeting, I started to feel, have I still got the motivation to, I don't know, be convincing that I think the things we're talking about are real possibilities. And last Sunday, I actually went on the climate change march, which you may not have heard of, unless you're involved in the relevant social media lists. Because it's hardly been mentioned on the media. The BBC gave about 10 seconds to it just before the sport in the late evening news. Now, 50,000 people marched on that occasion. Very, very exciting, original, creative, communal spirit on the march. 40,000 or 50,000 people, predominantly young people, but plenty of older people too. Ignored by the media largely, but coordinated on the same day with marches mobilising up to 1 million people across the world and aimed at trying to persuade national leaders to re-establish serious restrictions on CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases and address the problem of climate change. Now, there is a risk this will waste even more time, but I just wanted to show you some images from this march, because what they show is how this issue has actually not only mobilised large numbers of people, but has brought together people with very different perspectives. But also in each case, if you look at the slogans that they've invented, I tried to focus on those rather than the official organisations, you can see people are linking human well-being with the state of the planet, with the state of nature, and how that human well-being, survival itself, is actually threatened. Community policeman here was actually there was 3 young women dressed as in ambulance suits, and they tried to get the community police to join them. In fact, community police was so desperate to join them, it was actually hard to restrain them. It's not the kind of relationship to the police that we're used to on demonstration. Capitalism, we can't do business on a dead planet. Your present is my future. These are ones here. Grandparents, climate action, not just young people. Policemen with dreadlocks, again, not quite what we traditionally expected. Save our planet, save ourselves. As I said, a wide variety of people there. Butterfly wings, Houses of Parliament. Together we change the world, leave the oil in the ground. I don't want to drown. I think just most of us would agree with that. kind of consensual. And I thought this was theirs. There is no planet B. It's a lovely, brilliant slogan. Okay. I want to say something about the background. I mean, there's a very long history, and it's been expressed and related to by most of the speakers I've heard today at the conference, of focusing on injustice, focusing on inequality, focusing on poverty, deprivation within the human world. And, you know, if I can still use this word, left, I mean, that has been the central question that's been addressed by the left, by the trade union movement, by socialist political parties historically. That long tradition, with some notable exceptions, has existed on a separate trajectory from parallel senses of disquiet, resistances, mobilization struggles around environmental damage, environmental degradation. And indeed, in some elements, the struggle for environmental protection has seen itself and has been seen by the left as actually in opposition, so that particularly Malthusian forms of environmental concern seem to be saying that early death, poverty, mass disease and so on are actually part of the human condition, and any attempt to ameliorate poverty will just lead to people breeding more, and the environmental problem will be reproduced at a higher level. So there has been this long history of separation, even antagonism, between the left and some elements in the environmental movement. But at the global level, I think from the 1960s onwards, and especially through the United Nations and its various organizations, there's been a move which has, of necessity, transcended that division. From the 1960s onwards, there have been massive mobilizations drawing attention to the implications of the destruction of the rainforests, the acidification and pollution of the oceans, the desertification of large areas of the world, and then perhaps highest profile climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. And those very vital social movements, often operating at the global level, have been involved in setting an agenda, again at the global level, that there's a dire need to address environmental destruction on a global level, as a condition really of human survival. And that has been become an agenda for change that's been led by say Western, rich country, Northern, however you want to describe it, countries. The response of poorer countries of the world, the South, the developing so-called countries, has often been, we don't have the basic means to meet our needs. And part of the reason for that is the long history of rich country exploitation of our environment and our resources and our labour power. So we're not interested in restraining our use of our own environments for the sake of northern interests. So there had to be some recognition on the part of the northern countries in attempting to bring into being an environmental regime. There had to be some recognition of glaring economic, social, cultural, ecological inequalities across the world, so that the development perspective had to be brought into the picture. And that was done first of all in a limited way in the Stockholm Conference of 1972, but I would argue in a very big way it really was, there was an integration between this global aspiration for equality and justice across the world and the demand for environmental conservation. And the key concept that mediated that fusion was the concept of sustainable development. Now, there's a lot of cynicism about this concept, and absolutely rightly there is, but at its initial formulation in 1987, in the Brundtland report, I think it was a very, very radical concept indeed. The idea that we should be meeting the needs of the present without undermining the conditions for the future generations to meet their needs, that definition of sustainable development, is a very, very radical normative claim indeed, because it says we should be addressing need first of all. And who are the people who are in need? It's the poor across the world. So the priority of investment and trade of development policy and so on, must be to meet the needs of the global poor. And not just now, but into the indefinite future. In other words, the means that we use for this must be subject to the constraint, not only that they prioritise need, but also that they prioritise not undermining our global life support systems. That's an immense challenge to a global capitalist economic system. Capitalist firms are not actually used to prioritising their investment at meeting the needs of the poor, for the simple reason the poor can't actually pay it. And if you want to know why we haven't got a mass-produced way of dealing with the Ebola virus, that's the explanation. So, in that sense, prioritising needs rather than market demand or aspirations, this is an immense challenge to capital, as is the demand that you do it without damaging, undermining, destroying the planetary life support systems. Because transnational capital has no particular interest in that if it doesn't actually affect the bottom line financially. Now, as if to underline this point, without any connection with the Rio process, 1992, the Uruguay phase of the negotiations around the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade proceeded to even further liberalise and deregulate global trading and investment forms of organisation. So what happens is, as Rio, building on this concept of sustainable development, is saying we need normative regulation of investment across the world to protect the environment and to meet the needs of the poor. The GATT negotiations are saying, let it rip, let the market take over. Let's actually have only one norm, and that norm is that free markets, unconstrained by any kind of other normative requirement, are to be the order of the day. And indeed, it's that free market, neoliberal as we sometimes call it, it's that ideology and the forms of deregulation that that ideology sustains that has prevailed. So despite the fact that Rio issued in at least a couple of quite important agreements, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biodiversity Conservation, and also listed in about 34 chapters, I think, an Agenda 21, an agenda of how you bring together social movements, women, ethnic minorities, and how you bring all those into the democratic process and through that begin to address both inequality and environmental protection. All of that came out of Rio, and I think we can see in retrospect that that was a high point in global concern about both social justice and environmental protection. But what's happened since has been profoundly, as you know, depressing and disappointing, in that recall conferences have progressively weakened those commitments, and the agenda has become much more one of voluntary commitments by transnational corporations to some kind of moral obligation. The corporate social responsibility and environmental responsibility agenda, which is questionable in its effect. I mean, if you look at, say, the climate change issue, emissions globally were 28 billion tonnes per year in 1992, when these agreements were set up. They are now 40 billion tonnes per year. So the whole problem is escalating as these attempts to actually get things under control are becoming weaker. Now I showed you some images from a climate change demonstration, and it's true that the climate change as an issue has acquired a very high profile, and people somehow identify the environmental crisis with climate change. But in fact, it coexists with and interacts with a number of other major global environmental trajectories which are equally dangerous and perhaps less recognized in their seriousness. The first one is biodiversity loss, which was addressed to a degree in 1992, but we are still confronting a loss of biodiversity on the scale of the extinction events of the geological past. And that affects not just lions and tigers and charismatic big mammals, which is the emphasis you get from the media. It affects, for example, a drastic decline in the diversity of crop strains that are being grown, locally adapted crop strains across the world. That's within, if you like, domesticated species. And as far as wild species are concerned, the problem is not just the loss of this or that species, but the transformation of whole ecosystems and the expansion of what we might call a human-dominated domain as against natural and semi-natural systems, with serious threats to what we might call ecological functions or ecosystem functions. I resist the term ecological, sorry, I'll start again. I resist the term ecosystem absurdity because that leads into a kind of neoliberal commodification of nature. But we have to recognise that our survival, let alone well-being, does depend on pollination, it does depend on the CO2 absorption capacities of the rainforests and so on. So, biodiversity loss is a major challenge to us, and it is involved in both exacerbating the effects of climate change, but also actually is itself affected by climate change. Others, which are too obvious really to go into, maldistribution of access to fresh water, and tremendous problems across the world in both treatable and preventable infectious diseases that come from lack of fresh water for drinking, for washing, for sanitation and so on. And finally, access to affordable food. And again, there is a moral panic about this, which is being used by the biotech industry to support GM crops. But even if you believe the hype, this can make only an absolutely minimal contribution to feeding the kind of populations across the world that we're going to have. So what we have, I would argue, is a multi-dimensional global crisis in the relationship between a whole form of human, i.e. capitalist civilization, crisis in the relationship between that form of civilization and the rest of nature. And it's one in which the poorest across the world are the ones that are hit first and hit hardest. The richest in many parts of the world are still able to kid themselves that they're immune to this. We have a number of concepts that are being used, the concept of resilience, for example, fantasies of geoengineering, much more kind of reactionary and sinister notions of fortress nationalism in the face of imagined very large-scale climate change induced migrations, for example. And further kind of characteristic response, which I think is becoming either explicitly or simply by default, denial. I mean, we're simply excluded from the political agenda. And actually, what really brought this home to me was coming home from that demonstration and seeing that the BBC late news gave about 10 seconds to what was actually a global campaign about a central issue facing the future of humanity. So, I think we have the paradox of a major crisis and destabilisation in the world system, authenticated by overwhelming masses of scientific evidence, and yet virtually no serious political response. And so what I want to talk about next is why I think there has been virtually no mainstream or elite political response to this. And if I get a chance, maybe to say a little bit about what seems to me, if you like, the growing points of a much more sort of potential and diverse kind of political response from the grassroots. So I think in order to understand, first of all, why the political response is so weak, we have to go into trying to explain what the generative causes are of this crisis that I've tried to outline. Is it population growth? Is it fossil fuel dependence? Is it anthropocentric philosophy? Is it male domination? Lots and lots of arguments put forward, each of which I think captures something of the truth, but they're all partial and limited. And what I want to draw attention to is the fact that the material and energetic exchanges that mediate human relationships to the rest of nature are where we should look for the source of this. And that essentially means looking at economic relations, but not looking at economic relations simply as market relations, as contemporary economics tends to do, but it's looking at economic relations as relations of power between people and relations of extraction, exploitation, pollution in relation to the rest of nature. Now that the economic forms through which human labour and ingenuity, imagination and so on is combined in order to transform nature in order to meet human needs, that notion of the economy involves industrial production, the extractive industries, transport, agriculture, horticulture and so on. And these are all, overwhelmingly in our time, organised through the form of the capitalist firm, which survives within an overall market system. Now, it's a dominant economic system, the capitalist system, that shapes the direction of technical innovation, shapes the direction of investment, state policy, patterns of consumption and so on, and aspirations for consumption. So that a certain vision of a lifestyle in which we live relatively luxurious and safe and comfortable lives surrounded by commodities has become the dominant ideology. So that capitalist civilization depends for both legitimacy and political stability on its capacity in this sense to deliver the goods and to carry on delivering the goods and to meet ever-growing aspirations. Some of us at least heard talk in the previous panel discussion about this sort of vision of ever-growing commodification, middle-class lifestyles, for example, in a country like India. So for this reason, as well as others, the growth dynamic that is intrinsic to capitalism is something that isn't just there, if you like, as an add-on or something that can be changed. It's something that's absolutely intrinsic to the system. It doesn't follow logically from that this growth must necessarily produce environmental degradation or, for that matter, social injustice and poverty. So the question does arise, could we have economic growth? Could we have ever-rising aspirations for material goods without depleting the Earth's resources and destroying its life support systems, as envisaged by this concept of sustainable development? I want to say maybe not, but certainly not on the basis of capitalist organisation or disorganisation of our relationship to the rest of nature. Why not? First of all, because capitalism produces not to meet need, but to stimulate and to profit from market demand. And market demand is in turn is determined by the distribution of monetary resources among the population. So many millions across the world are unable to meet their basic needs because of lack of money, lack of capacity to be demand in the market, whilst affluent global minorities have this terrible problem of how to dispose of their superabundant spending power on luxury lifestyles. So from the standpoint of a rational use of the Earth's resources and human labour to meet need, this is a profoundly inefficient, destructive and unjust system. But more fundamentally, and this is, I think, a bit abstract, there are kind of theoretical approaches that make it more concrete, but I don't really have time to. I could name some orphans that you could look at. The key problem, I think, is that economic decision-making under capitalism, both for consumers and producers, has to take the form of monetary calculation. A single unit of measure covers the costs and benefits of each transaction. So we have cost-benefit analysis, accountancy balance sheets, profitability, shareholder interest, and so on, all taking the form of monetary calculations. And there are two problematic features of this. First of all, economic decisions have to follow the law of the market, supply and demand, competitive advantage, and so on. While the actual material process of producing, distributing, and consuming goods and services involves mobilizing material and energetic exchanges with nature, such as the burning of fossil fuels, chemical syntheses, hewing of wood and drawing of water, growing and harvesting of crops, and so on. And all of those processes operate according not to the laws of the market, but to the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, ecology, and are constrained by facts of geography, geology, and climate. So there's no correlation, there's no pre-established harmony between monetary calculations that drive the economic system and the processes that are set in motion behind it, by it, or are presupposed by it, or conditions of it. And the second problem, which I can just refer to as really the transformation of quality into quantity, is that production processes, as well as consumption, involve the combination of different sorts of work, different sorts of material, different sources of energy, to produce goods and services that meet qualitatively different human needs and desires. And those human needs and desires are reducibly different. So there has to be a process, if you're going to get all of that into monetary calculation, transforming all those aspects of human life and human activity into a single measure of monetary calculation. However, it's not just that these things mismatch each other. The actual survival of firms and of consumers in the face of competitive market relations depends exclusively on their ability to subordinate or override the qualitative considerations, the diverse conditions and consequences of their activity, as to override and subordinate those aspects to the overriding form of calculation, which is a monetary one. So, an example that's been foregrounded quite a bit in political debate people on low wages or suffering from cuts in benefit, or both, often now have to make a choice between feeding themselves and keeping warm. And so there are two qualitatively different, absolutely basic needs, which have to be somehow subordinated to the overriding condition of actually being able to pay to meet your needs. And similar considerations obviously apply to the production process itself, and extraction process and farming and so on, where a whole range of causal chains are actually mobilized by the productive or extractive or agricultural activity, which are not captured, which are not incorporated into the monetary forms of calculation. Conventional neoclassical environmental economics says, well, that's just a market failure. All you have to do is to give them market value, and I'll come back to that if I get time later on. Now, that's a general feature of the capitalist mode of production, but in its current globalizing phase under neoliberal ideological hegemony actually adds to the problems in a very drastic way. The greatly increased global mobility of trade and investment, the increased power of transnational corporations vis-à-vis nation states, the increased domination of finance capital over productive capital, the WTO rules for trade that obstruct any attempt to constrain capital on the basis of either its environmental or social impact, and the subordination, I think probably in a university context, this is particularly important. I mean, even just looking at what research has been done in the science department here, the subordination of scientific and technical innovation in both public and private sector research departments, that is now subordinated almost entirely to corporate interest. That has problems not just with the environment, but also, for example, for democracy, because there no longer are independent scientists who can actually challenge the claims of the corporations. Now, all of those features actually both increase the global social and ecological impact of the system, both increase the scope and the scale and generate genuinely no longer local or regional but actually global environmental crises. At the same time, as a whole neoliberal ideology of rolling back the state and fostering globalization, at the same time, any resources that nation states or democratic movements might have at the national level for getting some kind of purchase on this out-of-control juggernaut are now virtually minimal, because these processes are operating beyond the reach of the sovereignty of national states. And we do not yet have any kind of global institutions that has the power to really deal with that. There are fundamental reasons why we don't. So I think the failure of politics or the failure of mainstream politics to address these issues is partly explained by this powerlessness that I've tried to suggest, which has come from neoliberal globalization. No one has the power to deal with it. It comes from divisions between nation states and regions that have to do with geopolitical interests, and we're seeing those played out, for example, in the current demonization of Russia, and so on. But perhaps most of all, I think the failure of politics has come from a recognition by the more enlightened elements within mainstream politics of the depths of the transformation that would be required to address these problems. They're just terrified by the prospect of what this actually means. And there's a new book out Naomi Klein, which is This Changes Everything. And I think it's a good title, and sounds a bit arrogant, but I think Naomi Klein's sort of now caught up with what we've been arguing for something like 20 years. But that's great. I mean, you know, that's not a cynical remark, because she's got and deserves the public presence to actually get these ideas across, which we don't. I want to leave some time for discussion, so I'm just going to contract what I was going to say to a very simple summary. I think, for reasons that may be obvious already, that both the environmental economics and the way in which key sectors of the environmental movement have signed up to talking about natural capital and supporting green taxes and supporting tradable permit schemes and that kind of thing, that attempt to commodify nature as a way of speaking to the powerful and the decision makers, I think that's absolutely disastrous and deeply dangerous, and I've got a number of reasons for thinking that, because those powerful people and the forms of calculation that they're committed to necessarily lead in the direction of injustice and environmental destruction. If anybody wants more on that, we can talk about that. So I think what we need is a very fundamental transformation into a fundamentally different way of relating both to ourselves, to one another, and also to nature. And I think I don't think either if you like, the renationalisation of capitalism or market socialism really provide answers to this. You need a much deeper transformation. And at first sight, it seems that the idea that we might all live together, I mean, I'm almost sort of quoting John Lennon and Imagine, that we could all live together on a planet in peace, both with each other and based on the basis of equal respect, common ownership of the means of maintaining our lives, in peace with the planet too. That vision does seem impossibly utopian. But I have to say, as everybody might put it, I have to say that it's a bloody sight more realistic than the thought that the current form of civilization is sustainable, because it just is not. And the consequences of persisting with existing power relations and existing modes of thought about how we deal with problems is, I think, almost certainly going to lead to increasing wars and civil wars, resource wars, and the rise of various kinds of very sinister nationalism and racism and authoritarian regimes to actually, you know, the idea of environmental degradation and limitation itself will actually justify authoritarian measures. So I think the future is very dystopian unless we have an alternative vision of how society might be lived. And I think we have a large number, actually, of reasons for optimism. First one is that I would have said before 2007, 2008, global capitalism and its onward march looked absolutely impregnable. But the great crisis of 2007, 2008 has really shaken people's faith in that system in the long term. And actually, I think you get this government talking about the restoration of growth and so on, but it's all nonsense. You know, the system is really in deep crisis across the world. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I take comfort in demonstrations like the one last Sunday and the way that that's coordinated globally. We now have a global movement that sees the connection between ecological crisis and social injustice and sees the need to move beyond it in the direction of a more cooperative, more communal, more peace-loving form of life. Now, what we've been trying to do in the Green Study Group is to spell out in much more detail both the kinds of values that would underpin such a new civilization, but also to point to a whole range of prefigurative activities that are currently being experimented with in all parts of the world. Things like participatory budgeting, local exchange and trading networks, organic agriculture, alternative forms of agriculture, transition towns, a whole range of, albeit minority, albeit relatively small scale and partial, aspirations to do things differently. And that means many thousands of people are getting experience of how to do things differently. And it's a long way from saying how that will come together into a coordinated social and political movement which will actually have the power, have the legitimacy, have the strength to actually overthrow these currently dominant relationships. But overthrow them, we absolutely must. So we'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ted. Very good, particularly since you finished up on an optimistic note, which we want to go away with. But we have a few minutes, haven't we? Let's have a few questions at the back there.
Yeah, I've recently lived with a group of indigenous people, and their main argument is that the West had selected and choose their own development pathway, and why should they not choose to destroy the forest if that's the means of income generating for them? How, in your view, can we strike a balance between the notion of sustainable development and how forest people live in a more sustainable lifestyle? How do you see sustainable development playing a role in that? And kind of balance we strike, because their argument is, why can't we select our own development agenda, and if that includes destroying the forest, then we have a right to so do, because the forest belongs to us. You had yours, you destroyed yours, so who are you to tell me I shouldn't destroy mine?
Yeah, but that logic was used in 1992 at the Rio Conference. And it's a pointless logic, but it's also an insane logic. Because actually, their development will be compromised by the destruction of the rainforest, because the rainforest is the local context within which the conditions for their well-being actually depend, but also if the rainforest goes, and if the ice caps go, we're all finished. So I mean, I fully, accept the commitment to their autonomy and their right to do what they want with their environment. But I think that has to go along with attempts, and I suspect that that's not an absolutely universal view within the indigenous community. It's not a universal view within any indigenous community I know of. And, that debate has to go on, and that experience has to be built on.
But do you see the whole emission trading agreements where corporations or large companies can pay indigenous people to keep the forest standing? Do you see that as one alternative?
I don't see it as an alternative. I mean, when I actually criticise, that kind of project, I'm not saying I would want to reject it. I'm not saying it's hopeless. I'm not saying it makes no difference. But what I'm saying is that that's only acceptable as part of a much wider and more deep strategy to bring about real transformation. And if, companies are getting legitimacy from that is a problem. You see, I mean, none of these things are simple. But, you are pulled both ways. I mean, I buy fair trade coffee, but ultimately I think fair trade coffee isn't the answer. It's actual local farmers producing food for themselves, not sending luxury stuff to us, whether it's fair traded or not. You see what I mean? That's the kind of
Question here at the front.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ted. Very impressive, very complex arguments and evidence into concise. I'm wondering whether you really unnecessarily just got stage one of the argument. Stage two might be, picking up the various things you said, it is, environmental nature is not a problem if you're members of the elites, because you can buy your way out, you can get technical fixes, you can have, if you like, gating ecologies. It's a problem for those people out there, which is 90%. So I'm wondering, if this is the question, how we get around that, and whether one way might be to start to import in a different language ecological issues and concepts into the needs and wants and concerns of people for the natural qualities of life, and oppose that to the kind of artificial, restricted, and elite control of natural environmental resources.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting point, actually. And I mean, what I didn't talk about is how it seems to me, at least, that part of the, I mean, I talk a bit about politics and economics, but I think part of the shift is going to have to be cultural. That people actually start to feel and live differently in relation to non-human nature. And, you know, there was actually a talk in the last session, I disagreed with quite a large part of it, but basically it was arguing that simply, you know, caring about local wildlife is an important part in your sense of well-being. And so to bring home to people, you know, who have to live in, you know, metaphorically or literally gated communities, what they're losing by that is very important. So, you know, instead of us saying, you know, instead of us thinking of living with less commodities as a privation, as, you know, tightening our belts and so on, the alternative thing has to be to say, well, look, we can live a much happier, more fulfilled and enjoyable life if we do things differently. You know, if we pull back from nature a bit and actually allow nature to flourish and enjoy the butterflies and the birds and the flowers and all these other things. And you know, that's very much, you know, this is not kind of pie in the sky. It's actually what most people feel. I always draw attention to Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. And why is that such a powerful voice for the environment? Not because people assign a significant economic value to bird songs, you know, would actually pay so much out of their income to make sure that birds continue to sing. It's actually that somehow we have a deep sense of our connection with the rest of nature, and that something horrific has gone wrong if you actually have a screaming out bird song. So that, you know, that sort of cultural shift, or at least the bringing, if you like, into the centre ground of politics, of that kind of cultural feel, that seems to me a very big part of what we need to do. And I just mentioned Kate Soper's concept of alternative hedonism, you know, which is a really good idea. You know. So many different ways of getting happiness other than, you know, having the latest app on your smartphone.
I've got a couple of questions over there. Would you like to go first? Yes.
Well, just my point leads on to what was just said. Would you agree that like some countries in Latin America have actually embodied in their constitutions the rights of nature,
Yes.
Alongside the rights of man, the rights of humankind? Would you agree that the Enlightenment ideals of human rights are very important, but they're not enough, and that we do think it would be feasible that in other political systems we might incorporate the rights of non-human nature as they've done in, say, Bolivia or Ecuador?
Sure, yes. I mean, I agree with that as far as it goes. I argued positively in favour of the concept of animal rights, for example. But I think one of the problems with it is that although universally human rights are formally recognised, people's rights are not respected on a huge scale. And the content of the sort of like the Western liberal concept of even human rights is very restricted. It doesn't include, you know, a right to have food and shelter and healthcare and so on. So, I know, there's a whole series of sort of UN declarations and so on, so I don't want to go into the detail of this, but it just struck me thinking through some of these issues that there are a whole set of concepts that we use as, if you like, positive, on the left or even, if you like, on the centre left too. Right, liberty, equality, solidarity, democracy. Now, all of those concepts, it seems to me, are eviscerated and narrowed and limited in their application in our current society, but they still have a meaning which can be extended and deepened. And if you extend and deepen them, what you get to is a very transformed kind of society. Liberty means more than just having the opportunity to make choices in the market. It involves being able to control the conditions and the trajectory of your own life.
Exactly.
That's liberty. And it means, huge transformation, an ownership system and stuff.
I mean, North America, for example, the United States embodies all of those values in its system, and it doesn't seem to be a very happy society.
No, exactly.
I could recommend Ted's book, Natural Relations, on this kind of issue, on the animal rights issue. Yes.
Yeah, I guess this sort of follows on, actually, in terms of, I think solidarity is a key word, and it's also something that's very visible in the climate march on Sunday, because it involved groups across sectors of society, from reclaiming the power and fuel poverty actions to the fossil-free divestment movement, to scientists marching at least in New York, to the Green Party, to sort of like across the board. And I'm wondering what you think is the role of the universities in this, as we're in the university and in an academic conference, in the sense that we have this, as you said, the increase in corporatization of the university and sort of tailoring everything to the market, and we have a BP professorship of XYZ, and we have a BP lecture hall and all these kinds of things that buy the consensus and the goodwill, where we don't think about how it either explicitly or implicitly shapes the way that we think and who our allegiances lie with. And how do we oppose that within, how do we turn that logic around? We infuse this university with the solidarity towards the wider society and its place in it.
I just think this is an immense kind of problem, and there are individual ways of dealing with it. But I'm just thinking through kind of struggles that have gone on in my university, which I suppose is not as far down the line, because it's not predominantly science-based university. It's still got comparable problems in terms of lecturers being asked to bring in so many thousands of pounds per year from external funding and so on, and restrictions on what kinds of publications and put your work into. I mean, I've always, as an academic, thought in terms of publication as an act of communication to a specific audience. So I've never thought about the academic status of the journals that I've written for. But you can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore and keep your job, and you certainly can't do that anymore and get promotion. So there may be a role for unions there. There may be a role for more socially concerned groups of academics within the institution to try to challenge this. But it's a huge problem, and the whole neoliberalisation of higher education is, I think, a terrible consequence. And interestingly, I actually think it's very damaging for capital. They actually need critical thinkers. They need blue sky research. So maybe the first step might be to convince them of that, I don't know. But the other thing is, I mean, I'm not setting it up as a model, but the Great Green Study Group has been a tremendous inspiration to me, and that's, I mean, there's been academic and non-academic people participating in these discussions, and it's outside the university forum. So maybe developing resources and centres for intellectual activity outside the formal education system, which academics can participate in, might be one way of doing it. I mean, some of the social movement organisations that are big enough commission research. And Naomi Klein herself, I think, has a big kind of research team working for her. So maybe that, kind of mixed strategy along those lines.
Yes.
Yes, I was just wondering what you think about the more radical claim that environmental degradation, rather than being an unhappy consequence of neoliberalism or capitalism, for some sectors, is actually the desired result. In terms of, say, a narrow vision of the pursuit of profit, we take the national security state and the corporate, academic, and scientific institutions which benefit from that, not just in terms of foreign war, but in terms of internal security enforcement and surveillance. How do we sort of persuade people that there might be some interest in that? For example, if we look at the Pentagon 2050 document and other stuff coming out around, without being accused of wearing a tinfoil hat, so to speak.
No, that's what I know it's just very brief, but that's what I hinted at in the talk, actually, that this will provide legitimation, whether it's intended or not, it will provide legitimation for increasingly authoritarian measures and the suppression of civil liberties on quite a big scale. And I think that's going to be what we see, unless there is a serious resistance. I think if they could understand it, what they couldn't welcome would be the kind of destabilization of planetary life support systems that they're not. Somebody said in the demonstration, you can't do business on a dead planet. Well, that's right.
Right, well, I've been informed by the powers that be. That must be the last question. So all I can do is just thank Ted very much for a really inspirational talk and for joining.